corrections is always in the news, and it's a vital area as far as the community is concerned. Brendan Money has been involved with correctional services in one form or another for about 34 years. So if anyone knows anything about it, it's Brendan. I had the experience of having contact with Brendan when I was on the adult parole board for 12 years, because we had a lot of involvement with corrections, and he was always tremendously helpful and doing what he could to make the system run. I think what Brendan will do is give us an overview of correctional services in Victoria, what's involved in the delivery of those services, what we perhaps do well, what we perhaps could improve, his insight based upon the extensive experience, which starts back at Pentridge, and some of us, of course, recently had a visit to Pentridge, to B Division, to see what it was like back in the old days, which Brendan would have been very familiar with. So could you please make Brendan welcome?
Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Look, thank you very much. It's first of all, can I just congratulate you lot, just sitting there for the last half hour or so. I think it's just extraordinary that this group comes together with all your life experience and work experience to share stuff, information, and support each other. So well done to you. I feel a little bit under pressure now that I've got this clip on the thing and headphones on my head, but we'll do the best that I can. And Andy, you'll provide me advice around timing and stuff. Can I just say that I've always felt very lucky to have the career that I had. I didn't wake up one morning and go, I might just go work in corrections. I fumbled around between 18 and 25 years of age, with Dad putting the age employment section on the end of the bed most of the time, trying to get me sort of going, what am I going to do? I came from a big family of accountants and teachers. Neither interested me all that much. Anyway, what happened was that I did a bit of work as an honorary probation officer, because that's what they had in those, back in the 80s, honorary probation officers, and then went back to uni for a couple of years, got a placement in community corrections, and then a placement in Pentridge on the social work team. In those days, they'd had a lot of suicides of prisoners coming into Pentridge, and there was a high suicide rate, so they gathered this social work team to try and reduce the amount. So that's kind of where I started. I did a lot of things over the years. I worked in the Prisoner Classification Board. I went into uniform to manage the high security units. I managed the closure of Pentridge over a 4-year period. Then I became a prison general manager across lots of jails across the state, and managed the women's prisons for the best part of 10 years. And the last 10 years of my career was an assistant commissioner, and I was responsible for the security classification and placement of all the prisoners. So, and that's why I think it was such a privileged career. I stumbled into it, and I loved every minute of it. I was jumping out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning to try and work out what was going to happen that day. So I've always felt very grateful, and I met so many people in all walks of life. And that's one thing about corrections. You will meet people from everywhere. If you want to look at how society's ticking, go for a walk around some of the prisons. So today is a bit of a mixture. I am going to do quite quickly around some structural stuff and some numbers, just to give you some context. And then I thought it's almost like a little bit of a storybook presentation of things that I saw happen over 34 years that I thought, some of them didn't even happen in the prison, but they impacted the correctional system. And I thought that it would be a good way of kind of just demonstrating how corrections is such an important part of society and the legal system. You know, it has to do a good job, and it doesn't always do a good job. But it changed a lot, and a lot of those changes came to it from things that happened in the outside world. The afterlife, well, I'm not sure we'll get to that, but... So just to give you a bit of a quick setting, Australia-wide, you know, you've got a corrections industry worth about $6.4 billion. Victoria these days, about $1.3 billion. 14, 15 prisons, it varies a bit because they're in the midst of closing and shutting a few, but 6,000 to 7,000 prisons. When I retired in 2019, we had 9,000 prisons, so it dropped to about 6,000, and it's probably going up a little bit more. The costs always vary a bit, but the costs that I sort of generally see are around 131,000 in Victoria, but you'll get documentation that will show you costs of a prisoner being around 195,000. A recidivism rate, which means people coming back to the system within 2 years, is around 40 to 50%. But I'll tell you an interesting story about an era that I worked in where that changed. Community corrections is always a fascinating area, not an area that people are generally familiar with. But that's the community, you know, community corrections is all over the state of Victoria. So 50, 60 officers in Bairnsdale and Ararat and all sorts of Mildura, all sorts of places where they manage all these people on parole orders, community orders, offenders doing community work, fine default, and post-sentence orders these days, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. I think around 12,000 offenders, although I think it was up to 15,000 at one point. But you can see the cost is dramatically cheaper. So 10 to 12,000, probably a bit more these days, and a recidivism rate of around 25%. Most of my stuff really, I spent most of my time in prison, so a lot of the stories really are around prisons. But I will say that community corrections was kind of an area that I always saw was a good option for low-risk offenders, but it also had a lot of problems with its workforce. And in some ways, I always saw it as a slightly neglected correctional part of the correctional system. Keep going. So you'll see the recidivism rate is lower, the costs are lower, so it was always an option that probably deserved a bit more attention in a resource sense than it got. And it probably had a lower wage base than prison, so it's hard to attract staff at times. But
how to do up someone's pants.
Thanks. So you've taken me to a new world in culture. I've done a lot of presentations over the years. Never someone hanging off the back of my pants.
Well, it's quite an experience for both of us.
Thank you. So let me just sort of do this kind of storybook thing, and people can stop me, ask questions, you know, and do whatever you wish to do. But I started in the mid-'80s, as I said, in the social work team at Pentridge, and I moved around a lot, but there were things when I was putting this together that I thought, no, you know, they're really things I actually remembered. And I thought for a progress group with people with so much life experience, some of this stuff might sort of come back to you a little bit. And the first thing I remembered was the late 80s, like 86 to 88, where all these events happened in the community. Now, there was impacts in the prison service, but it was a difficult time, I remember, for the community around Russell Street, Hoddle Street, Queen Street, Wall Street. You know, these were significant events in Victoria that we hadn't perhaps seen much before, and for those sort of events where people were massacred or killed for all sorts of reasons to happen over a period of years was a very traumatic time, I think, for the community. But what I learned from it, though, was, you know, with the exception of the Queen Street killer, the rest of them came into Pentridge. And I recall very much the media and the political intensity level just went through the roof, and that would stayed with me for a very long period of time. The next one was the 1987 JICA fire. So in 1980, I think there was probably some episodes of terrorism around the world, globally. The government elected to build this high security, high tech prison called JICA. I was in the grounds of Pentridge. I worked there early days, but they built it with all technology. So to open the cell doors, you pushed a button. To contact or talk to the prisoner, you talk through an intercom. So they cut all of the human connection out, and that was an experience that I lived with for my 34 years, because I've never forgotten it. More recently, I did some work in the Philippines, and the JICA case study was one that I talked to them about. Because what happened, I think we had one terrorist. I think there was a Turkish embassy. It was a car bombing. Levin Demirian came in. He went into the high-tech JICA, but we didn't get any more. So it filled up with badass gangsters from all around, you know, the state. And ultimately, it ended in 1987 when 5 of those prisoners, you know, tied table tennis nets around the electronics and set fire to the blankets, and 5 of them were killed. It was a terrible event, but it was an event that, you know, taught me a lot about how important, if you work and run in prisons, you need to have lots of contact with your prisoners. And what that electronic system did was took away that contact. The next one was the 1990 closure of the Bluestone prison. So Castlemaine, Beechworth, Sale, Geelong, all these old prisons that used to hold, you know, 80 prisoners or 70 prisoners, and the government closed them all. And then it was like the new age of prisons. You know, we built Barwon Prison and we built Loddon Prison, and these new prisons, you know, I was able to be a part of the design of how they were built, a different way of building prisons, a different way of managing prisons. And then came along the 1992 Kennett government that announced the closure of Pentridge and the privatisation of 45% of Victorian prisons. It was big news. Pentridge was big, had about 1,000 prisoners, 600 staff, been there since 1850. And then one day on the tennis court, I think it was Pat McNamara, was the Deputy Premier in the time, announced that we're going to close it. It's too problematic, it's too old, the infrastructure's too old, the work practices are too old. And that, of course, was something that people didn't believe could ever happen, but it certainly happened. And then the privatisation of 45% of the prisons in Victoria was unheard of across the world. A lot of systems had private prisons operating at around 4 and 5%. Victoria went for the 45% model, so nearly half your prisoners in the hands of private facilities. So the closure of Pentridge was incredibly interesting. So when it went for 4 years, that's a long time to try and run a live maximum security prison whilst you're closing it, whilst the staff know that their future is going to end. And as the staff got more unsettled, of course, the prisoners would get more unsettled, and you know the risks were high around suicide, escape, you know, riot, kind of dysfunctionality. So it was a very difficult and tenuous time to get through 4 years of a closure period. And one of the other things that I learned during that 4 years period was how important the stakeholders or the interested parties were in prisons. You know, so when the announcement of COVID was made, people came from everywhere. You know, the people who own the pubs in Sydney Road and the shops and all the lawyers and judges and, you know, all these amazing people who had done all this amazing work in incredibly difficult circumstances wanted to be a part of the closure of Pentrin. So it was a very sensitive, difficult time, but taught me a lot about, even though prisons get a terrible amount of bad publicity in the metropolitan media, it did teach me about how many interested parties there are. People want to know what you're doing and how you're running the prisons, and, you know, the judges of the world calling me in and out of court to explain myself as to what we were doing with certain prisoners. It was a fascinating time. So it's just, these are like random events. So it is a bit of a storybook, so I apologise. So please stop me if you think you'd like to talk about something. That the late 80s to 1990s, I was on the prison classification board. There's a guy called Gary David. He was doing a 14-year sentence for armed robbery, but he was also one of the first people I'd experienced that was bordering on terrorism. So he threatened to poison the water supply in Melbourne. And so there was this was my first exposure to governments going, well, hang on a sec, you know, it may be dangerous for us to release this guy. It was also my introduction to the world of self-mutilation. Gary was the king of mutilating his body. And so every time things didn't go well for him, he would mutilate his body to such a point it was just like indescribable. But self-mutilation was part of my life in terms of prisons and managing people who self-mutilated. So Gary certainly taught me a lot there. And they actually introduced this thing called the Community Protection Act, which is specifically to Gary David, that kept him beyond his the end of his sentence. So to me, corrections was always about managing the sentence. You know, you come in a certain day, you go home a certain day, and then all of a sudden, what's this? You know, we're managing this guy who finished his sentence. Anyway, he ultimately died on the surgery table as a result of a whole lot of poisoning, you know, from swallowing metal and, you know, cutting his body up. But just when that happened, we were actually looking for a house to live him in on the grounds of Mont Park. So, but that connects up with something I'll talk about a little later, and that's the world of post-sentence detention, when corrections all of a sudden gets involved in managing people that have finished their sentence. The gangland wars, I won't talk a great deal about. Most of you will have some exposure to it. It caused a lot of issues around the prison system, obviously, where I think between 98 and mid-1990s, there were probably 40-odd people were randomly killed as these power groups in the Melbourne underworld were randomly killing each other, and that became a bit of a headache in prisons in terms of custody conditions, keeping who was on what side, keeping people separate. You know, it was an interesting time. The next one was an interesting part of my life as well, and that was when I talk about the privatisation. They privatised prisons to three big global companies, an American company, a European company, and two American companies. But what they did was they had this evaluation processes that companies applied to manage the prisons, and they gave each of the companies one jail each. So they created this kind of, it was the era of economic rationalism and competition, and so three companies had three different prisons. One was a women's prison, one was a medium security prison down near Sale, and one was a maximum security prison called Port Phillip Prison. Three different companies. The women's prison, the company that got the women's prison, they thought they were got 125 women. It'll be reasonably easy for the company to get started. Well, it was a nightmare. They completely underestimated the complexity of managing women in custody, and it only lasted 4 years, and the government took it back, which is absolutely unheard of. We couldn't find another example of it anywhere in the world. But the reason I put it down was because I was a general manager of the prison in Central Victoria. They rang me and said, we've got so many days before we're going to go in and step in on this prison and take it over. I'm like, this is like getting like a Hollywood movie to me. So I come down, they give me an office, they give me a week, and this has all sort of been done allegedly in secret. So I gather a workforce, prison officers, the best prison staff I could find from around the state, and then one crazy day, we basically burst through the main gate and took the prison over. So the prison went from Corrections Corporation of Australia back to Corrections Victoria. This is a very long story, and I'm not going to bore you with it all, but it was an extraordinary experience to take over a prison from a private prison company. The prison had enormous issues around, self mutilation, riotous behaviour, drugs, drug, sex, rock and roll. It was full on for about 4 years until we took it back. And even then, I was the general manager there for the next 8 years, and it took 5 or 6 years just to turn the prison around, to be honest. The next one that I found was quite significant was this era where it was a Labor government, and I think the minister was on a bloke called Andre Hairmeyer, who wasn't well known, but he's somebody who executed a bit more correctional vision than I'd ever seen before. He met with us all as prison managers, he met with the judiciary, he met with non-government agencies, and then he fought a battle in cabinet and got this bundle of money that they call the Corrections Long-Term Management Plan, and the plan was to try and reduce recidivism, to stop people coming back to jail, to get better value for the taxpayers' money. And I thought, well, this is going to be a bit interesting. So they did reduce recidivism. They dropped it from 40% to 32%. They built a remand centre, they built a transition centre, they built a treatment prison, they bolstered community corrections, and you probably remember other things, but they did a whole lot of stuff. They introduced lots of pre and post release, youth interventions. It was just like a tsunami of programmatic interventions to try and reduce the amount of recidivism, and they did it. Now it's not lasted, but it was an interesting era to work in as a prison manager, because you saw a whole lot of new ideas and new ways of running prisons, and you realised that having a treatment prison was quite extraordinary. So big focus on sex offender treatment, big focus on violent offenders. Fascinating era. I think the era's slipped, the recidivism rate's gone back up, the world's changed, as it always does. Terrorism I'll talk briefly about, because that came into our lives in a big way. 2005, big trial, Pendennis trial, 12 people charged with a whole range of acts of terrorism, including, I think one of the charges was the prospect of blowing up the MCG. Anyway, it was a big time, it was a new world, and we got ourselves into all sorts of trouble. We treated the 12 terrorists as a group of individuals, and then there was, the terrorists themselves then formed this kind of brotherhood, and then there was a lot of complaints, a lot of issues. The Supreme Court got involved in terms of the management of the trial, and I think I learned a lot about risk assessment. When you get prisoners, it's very dangerous to do a risk assessment on them as a group. The individual risk assessment is always absolutely critical. And eventually, as we dealt with terrorism, as the years went on, we developed this system of just doing individual risk assessments. So there might have been, if you had 12 people charged with terrorist charges, there really was only 2 or 3 who posed any sort of risk to the corrections system. The rest of them we could disperse into our mainstream prison system and not be concerned about radicalisation or these highly influential terrorists blowing up our system. It was just that issue around dealing with the person in front of you. What exactly are the risks with these individuals? Big learning experience for people like me and lots of others. Sex offender management is a big one that burst onto the scene, like in the mid-2000s. That we had the Brian Jones, Mr. Baldy, and a whole lot of other people. There was a guy who got out, completed his sentence, a bloke called Ford, William Ford, and he raped and murdered very quickly in the Ballarat area. Anyway, there was a massive explosion around how we're going to deal with these sex offenders who are completing sentences and then just going out into the community. And that was the introduction of lots of post-sentence orders. We even at one point, we de-gazetted a piece of land at the Ararat prison and put like some units on it and pretended that it was a community corrections area, and they put these sex offenders who finished their sentence onto this de-gazetted piece of land in the prison. So, you know, it's a story in itself, but it's just an example of the world changing and the community expectations, the media, the political interest, and how, you know, we were needed to dance on our feet in terms of managing these people who no longer were doing their prison sentence. They weren't doing their parole, they were finished. So, how are we going for time, Andy?
No, you're right.
All right.
You're going well.
So, feel free to stop me at any point. These were just a couple of other things that I thought were worthy of mentioning. That the murder of Carl Williams in high security was a big one for us, obviously. You know, it was a tough time. Lots of reviews and examination of why that had occurred. But, you know, out of it came a new and improved way that we manage Crown Witnesses. Crown Witnesses were becoming a much bigger part of our system, particularly as a result of the gangland murders, where the police were pursuing people to provide evidence to solve murders, and it was terribly tricky. So we certainly improved our management. We built different places that could manage Crown Witnesses in a much better way. The Brunswick rape and murder of Jill Maher by Adrian Bailey, who was a parolee, is probably a time judge you would remember extremely well. I won't go into the detail of it, obviously, but he was a parolee. He'd done a lot of time for rape, and obviously, you know, he'd reoffended in a significant way whilst on parole. Massive amounts of publicity, and then what followed was a range of murders by parolees at the time that would ultimately change the parole system forever. Just another example of an event, I guess, that changed the way we did business and the way the parole board did business, and you know, they're those sort of significant events that change our lives. I needed to talk a little bit about legislation, and there are probably people in this room who are way more qualified than I, but over that 2011-2019 period, you know, I did see so many changes to the law, some of which came out of nowhere to corrections people. You know, suspended sentences were abolished. They had all sorts of varied community corrections orders that were all abolished. They had treatment orders that were abolished. Home detention got abolished. Parole reform came in as a result of the Bailey thing. Bail reform seemed to be endless. So ultimately, at a point in 2018, I was the assistant commissioner responsible for the prisoners, and it was the first time in my life I got phone calls to say, "You haven't got any prison beds. Like, you've got no beds." And of course, the police were still busily arresting people, and so my life from 4 o'clock in the morning was police ringing me saying, "Oh, you know, we've got this person, we've got these cells are too full," and and I'm like, "Oh, I haven't got any beds." Like, to have no prison beds was just something that was completely foreign to me. We went to the Pilbara, we bought shipping containers. I was on planes to New South Wales to meet with companies who they could do quick build prison blocks, you know, build them off-site, swing them over the wall, you know, it was just insane. But, you know, that was what we needed to do. Things had caught up with policy changes that occurred we hadn't been part of, so we didn't have it on our radar. Perhaps that's our fault, I don't know. it was a very big learning experience to be running a prison system that had, we were used to being quite full, but to have no beds was pretty amazing. And then 2015 was the Sean Price murder of Master Buckatik in Doncaster. I don't know if you recall. It got a massive amount of publicity. He'd finished his sentence. He'd been put on a supervision order after his sentence, so he's being managed by Community Corrections, and yet he still does this murder. You know, and so that creates all sorts of media and political intrusion around what happened. Did you manage him well enough? You know, what are you going to do with him into the future? So it was another event that I guess that stuck with me for a very long period of time. A couple of other quick ones. I've been around for obviously a long time. I've seen some trouble around the system over the years, but the Remand Centre riot in 2015 was a big one. And I think it was a bit of an accident, to be honest. There was a smoking ban in the prisons, and the Remand Centre was going through this smoking ban, trying to talk to the prisoners about cigarettes and stuff not being available, and they were gathering in groups. And this particular day, they gathered in groups about the smoking ban, but the dialogue was pretty reasonable. But when you gather prisoners in too many groups and they got a bit of a cause, that's something that you need to pay very big attention to, and I don't think they paid enough attention to. And what happened was they started yelling to each other from one yard to another and shaking the cyclone internal fences. And over a short period of time, they realised that the fences were actually coming out of the ground. And I think that's what did it. The adrenaline kicked in, and they bowled the fences over. And then they formed this massive group. And they didn't go after the staff, so no one was hurt or killed, a bit traumatised, but they trashed the prison. Big learning experience there. It cost the best part of $80-90 million to put the prison back together. So it's a big event, big night, big pressure on the system. How do we manage without our big remand centre, given it's trashed? And it was an interesting experience. The growth of post-sentence orders for sex offenders and serious violent offences, I've probably talked enough about. It's part of our world now. Supervision orders, detention orders, people getting, they complete the sentence, then they get a detention order, and stay in prison as for something they might do, and then a supervision order where they're out in the community. Now, I think the detention order numbers have declined, actually, so they may not, the judiciary never particularly liked them, and that was always understandable, and that was all about, people giving evidence about, well, okay, this guy has finished his sentence, but he's seen still as a risk to the community. And I guess that's the dilemma. How do you deal with that? How do you prevent the crimes? And I guess 2016, institutional violence in the youth system, and I think the youth system is probably subject to a lot of current scrutiny, and I got involved in 2016 when they transferred, there was a whole lot of attacks on the youth staff in the youth system, and they transferred about, 30, maybe 25 of their most violent offenders and put them in one of our units at Barwon Prison and de-gazetted it and called it a youth prison. It didn't last very long because obviously all the lawyers got involved, and it went back to Supreme Court, and it was ruled an unlawful thing, and so the young people went back to the youth system. But it was an example of people trying to, solve the institutional violence in the youth system, and what was the root cause of it, and how would you deal with it. And at one point, they actually transferred 5 prisoners over to the adult prison system. So the youth parole board transferred them over, and we had them in one of our maximum security prisons, and that didn't. It worked okay for a while, but ultimately we got into a fair bit of trouble through the media of holding one of the young guys who I think was only 16 at the time, but he was difficult in one of our maximum security prisons. So it's just another example of the system needing to adapt, I guess, to the changing needs. So, how am I going, Andy? I've got a couple of minutes.
No, you're going well.
All right, so these are just some reflections, and people can sort of ask me questions about that. A balanced criminal justice system. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a judge, but I had this extraordinary interest in the criminal justice system, and I watched it change and do things, and I saw lots of policy changes and legislative changes, and it so drove home the importance of having a balanced criminal justice system. I'd seen the tough on crime agenda, what happens to the prison systems, if you haven't got the balance. Heavily involved in managing high security units, trying to build better high security units. Go back to Pentridge, they were cell blocks, towers, patrols, labour yards. And then we got to Barwon, we built a much more open, still very, very secure, but a very different high security units. And some of the things about high security units is they work for a while until they don't work, and then you go back to a more restrictive regime, and then you come back to a more progressive regime. And it only takes, like with the Barwon I thought we had a really good Acacia high security unit, held 20 prisoners or whatever. It was very functional, except 5 of the prisoners tunnelled out through the one of the yards, got out on the other side of the wall, and were crawling across the prison one night. Now, none of them got out. We got them all, but that resulted in that little grass yard we had in the high security becoming 15 feet of concrete. So, but that's the nature of high security units. And recently, I did a bit of a paper for the New Zealand criminologist who was working in New Zealand on the Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch shootings. They have got him in a high security unit in Christchurch, I think, in a very, very, very restrictive regime. This criminologist got the job of providing advice to the government. So he rings me and he says, "Well, what would you do with somebody who's just in a cell all day, and everyone's kind of too afraid to kind of move him?" And I said, "Well, you have to do something, because if you just leave a person in a cell without any hope of something or any incentive to do something, you will finish up with some very, very serious consequences. Either the staff will get killed, the prisoner will kill himself, something terrible will happen." And so we talked about the importance of people, even in the most restricted environments, of having opportunities for fresh air, small amounts of programs, perhaps even some arrangement around visits, even if it's video or FaceTime, contact things toward, it's just like us in our own lives, I guess. When things are tough, you've got to have something for which you can work towards, and even prisoners in the highest level of security need that. Security versus rehabilitation, it was just fascinating over the years. I can remember going to 10 meetings one day as a prison manager in the women's prisons, and each of the meetings, were bureaucrats and other departments and law enforcement people. Each of them had a different agenda about how I should run the prison. Completely different. And to me, that was like, well, that's my job, is to kind of find a way to kind of keep all these needs and expected outcomes balanced in order to run what I used to call a healthy prison. Like, if you run a prison that is torturous, unfair, corrupt, then you will have one hell of a prison to manage, and it's not a place that you want. It's not good for security arrangement, it's not good for rehabilitation, it's not good for the community, it's not good for the taxpayer. You've got to have a good, healthy system where you can manage people who are difficult, you can identify the risks, get people out who are not a risk, get them on with their lives, keep in touch with their families, because there's no, I learned very, very early days, there is no replacement for families. Governments can run all sorts of services, but if you can keep prisoners in touch with their family, no matter who it is, it might be grandma, Uncle Fred, whoever it is, if you can keep that contact going, then you'll increase the opportunity for that prisoner not to come back, but you also make, the prison run much better, without the self-mutilation, without the protests. All those programs are important. The security, of course, is important, and the art of prison management is really to get it all right. Leadership and culture, I just, is part of my, and I still do a bit of it around, what the sorts of leadership run institutions well, like hospitals and, prisons and those crazy places that are, if they're not led well, they turn into, really high-risk places. The staff themselves become the focus rather than the client or the prisoner or the patient or whatever it is. It's fascinating. And I've seen so many good leadership, poor leadership, and, you see the ramifications of that. And just like in closure, really, more recently I did some work in the Philippine prisons, and that kind of drove home to me, some of the systems around some of the enormous difficulties they faced. And they had like 130,000 prisoners across 450 prisons, all of their prisons understaffed, under-resourced and corrupt. And so, to their enormous credit, they wanted to find better ways to lead their prisons, to change their systems, against enormous odds. So, I still do some of that, usually about 3 or 4 times a year. But, it really drove home the importance of leadership and culture in any correctional system. I think enough.
Can I just hit you with something that you've had a real hand in your career, the changing role of the prison officer, like from unit management right through to what the old style was?
Yeah.
Can you make a comment about that, Bruce?
Yeah, that was one of our greatest challenges. And when I left, it was still going on.
Yep.
Like, we did this campaign, once Pentridge, we sort of tried to play with it a little bit in Pentridge and try and get prison officers not to have that sort of security role, but understand that there was a security role that they could play in dealing with the prisoner, gathering intelligence, case managing the prisoner, understanding the programs, and that was a hard road. So Pentridge then closed. Private prisons came in and brought in their philosophies around case management and rehabilitation, and that was needed a step up from us in corrections. So we then changed all the training for prison officers. We changed the recruitment systems. We looked for different people. We looked for better gender balances. We tried to get prison staff to understand the value of managing prisons in small groups, the value of information being documented, the value of referrals, the value of treatment. All of it is, a part of the security system and a part of the rehabilitation system. And one of the lectures I gave in the Philippines was, don't rely on one method of security. It'll let you down. If you build a wall and you have handcuffs and battens and keys and cell doors, terrific. But if you don't have good systems of human contact, somebody will get over your wall. Whereas if you've got a good system of human contact, then you'll find out the day before that somebody's going to go over your wall. It's a simple way of explaining it, but it's true, and educating prison officers that is the case, that their security is more than just gates and doors was critical, and I think the battle still goes on.
Yeah, well done,
yeah. Other questions or?
Yeah, I think I heard on a podcast recently, a British one, which included a guy who'd been Minister for Prisons in Britain. Apparently the British prisons are in a real mess. But I was interested in the privatisation point. I think they found great difficulty there because privatisation is concerned with making money, whereas the government, of course, is supposed to be concerned with governing the people. Has that been a problem here with privatisation sort of upping the costs, not providing the service?
For sure. Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, they're big global companies. They run all sorts of things, and prisons is just a part of their money-making machine.
Yeah.
Having said that, when the 90s happened, I thought, well, it's a policy that's used by government. We've got to make this work. And we did. We tried really hard, and so did the private. It depended on their leadership as well. So some of them were really good for periods of time, then the leadership would change and then be problematic. What I did see though was, because corrections always had to change as the system changed and things changed, whenever we needed to change the private prisons, you had to have your checkbook in your back pocket, because they're going to charge you. We need more prisons there, we need to build that unit there, we want to reduce that program. And they go, well, that's fine, but this is what it's going to cost you. So originally the private prisons in the Kennedy area were seen to be cheaper, 12-hour shifts. They could run better rosters, so they would be cheaper for the taxpayer. But in the long term, they're actually, they'll put their hand out for absolutely everything, every single change. And even now, because the prison numbers have dropped so much, they've dropped from 9,000 to 6,000, they're closing Port Phillip Prison, which was one of the big private prisons out in Laverton. It was built as a 600 and probably has got as high as 1,200. And only 3 or 4 years ago they signed another 20-year contract with the company, and now the prison numbers have dropped, so they're going to close the private prison. I can't imagine what that is going to cost them, because these companies will have more lawyers than you can poke a stick at, and this government will be in breach of that contract. They'll have to pay it, and they'll pay it out. It'll be another one of those roads where you rip up the contract. But, the dropping of the prison numbers from 9,000 when I retired to 6,000, that was like you couldn't ever foresee that. And a lot of it was due to COVID. So COVID, as we were all locked up, so were the prisons. And in the prison system, if people are locked up and not getting access to their exercise and programs, they were earning emergency management days. So they were getting days off their sentence. So that quickly reduced the prison numbers, but also the judiciary were not sending as many people to prison because of the conditions, obviously, that came with COVID. So, it was a big change, not something that was ever seen. So they shut Durrangole Prison, which was a public minimum security prison, a farm up near Shepparton, and that's closed. Port Phillip will close probably this time next year. And when I was there as an assistant commissioner, we built this Western Plains prison because the numbers were going through the roof. So we built another maximum security prison, which has been empty. So they closed the private prisons and they'll put them into the public system. But you're right, the private systems across the world, there's pros and cons. Ideologically, do you want to have people in custody and big global companies making profits from it? Probably not.
I was going to ask whether with the young people that are copying a lot of media at the moment, the repeat offenders that are in and out of custody or whatever, what would you do if you were still working to try and solve this problem? Do you lock them up, or do you how do you work? How do you handle it if you've got a 14-year-old that is continually causing problems?
Yes, it's not an easy one, but I did get involved a little bit in the system when they were having so much violence toward their staff. And one of the things that I was sort of encouraging them to do in terms of the youth centres to try and reduce the violence was have a much better risk assessment system, so that anyone who was demonstrating physical violence towards a staff member should be managed a different way, at least for a while. So move them away, let all those kids who were just doing their time in youth centre, let them go to school, let them do programs, but keep them away from people who are bashing other people up, essentially, which is really what we did in the prison system. So that was one area that I think that they could do better. Their view was everyone was a child and everyone should have access, and they didn't build the youth facilities that allowed them to separate people. And I don't mean separate them forever, I mean separate them for a while until they understand the consequences of what they've done, and then try and get them out again with, you know, psychological help or education or youth systems or whatever. So that would be one advice. Now, the other stuff in terms of the bail out in the community, you know, people, repeat offenders, I think that's probably a better question for someone like David. I mean, I think the modern world is a bit more demanding in terms of, you know, if you're going to get bail, they're becoming less tolerant for repeated bail. So I think probably in my view, that's probably an area that the judiciary needs to kind of perhaps explore with the policy makers about how you deal with it. Look, I know, I just stopped for a minute because I've had these horrendous meetings with a lot of bureaucrats in the Department of Health and Human Services towards the end of my career. And they were of the view that I was a jail person and therefore, you know, you're a jail person, go away, which I was fine. I kind of understood that a little bit. But I really did see in their eyes that they had a very 1980s welfare model about how they managed what they kept referring to as children. And I said, well, they are children, I agree, except there are probably some of them that need to be dealt slightly different than the other children. So the other children can get on with their lives and maybe not come back. But if they're subject to, you know, prison standovers, prison bashings, prison assaults, you know, and the staff are getting assaulted, and you're still letting people kind of mix together, then, you know, that is very traumatic and very difficult, and you may well create a whole new system of young 14, 15-year-olds who are just trying to protect themselves. So high risk, manage a different way to lower risk would be my advice to anyone managing institutions.
All right.
Thank you.
I've got something for Brendan over here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I think we've been very fortunate to finish the year with a presentation like that from Brendan, because he has given a very insightful and on the ground view of just what the situation is with our correctional services. I mean, you can get views expressed from high up who don't have that on the ground experience, which Brendan has got, and he's touched on areas that are difficult, but have to be solved if we can. And I mean, I have to say that the Victorian community have been very fortunate to have someone like Brendan Money, who's been prepared to spend 34 years in the correctional system running prisons. I don't know, he spent 8 years running the women's prison. I can assure you that I spent 12 years on the adult parole board, and the worst day of my life was a day at the women's prison, because it was just horrendous dealing with the situations that you had to deal with. And that was just, you know, for a day, whereas Brendan had it day after day after day.
very difficult situations with these people, these women who nearly always were extremely badly damaged and presented huge challenges in terms of trying to assist them to have some sort of meaningful life after they got out of the prison. So, Brendan, thank you, mate. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
You're an old Paradian too, which that helps. That helps.